All right, we're now recording. So the first agenda item for today is the 0.2 scoping and timeline and whatnot. We talked about this at last week's TOC meeting. And basically what we wanted to do was try and target roughly beginning of November, 11.1 for trying to snap 0.2. The logic behind that was to try and have a new cut of Knative in time for KubeCon with time to slip. And slip again, for folks to roll that out to the their respective systems.
So a chance for us to have a round of fixing the bugs after we do that.
Right. Plus holidays and stuff like that. Right.
Oh,
Things
are there holidays that happen at the end of November?
Basically, that was sort of the rough guiding light for the date. So there was a project level 0.2, organization level 0.2 project in GitHub. I broke that into a 0.2 and a 0.3 project within the serving repo. And the 0.2 stuff should reflect sort of the current thinking in terms of scoping there. It's mostly the stuff that was sort of in progress from the old 0.2 board. And a lot of this stuff is either starting to land or well in progress. So I would encourage folks to go and look at it and think for the next couple of weeks about things that will improve stability and holding off for a couple of weeks on things that might be super destabilizing. The other thing we're going to start to try and across the different working group leads gathering is sort of release notes of sort of the headline things that have changed since 0.1. So if you have thoughts on that, send me a note. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say about that. Without further ado, I will hand things over to Ben and Jim, who I believe are filling in for Paul to talk about namespace Knative.
Yes, Jim, I'm going to present. I'll show my screen here. Let's see if this works. All right, you should be able to see the browser screen with the issue and serving that Paul created for allowing controllers and serving to run in a single namespace. So can everybody see?
Yep.
All right. So Paul outlines the benefits here, but at a high level, we'd love to be able to, or at least explore what it would take to run Knative in a single namespace. And so we've broken that issue down specifically into what would it take for Knative serving controllers to run in one namespace and only manage the resources in that namespace. And we have a similar issue for a Knative build with a pull request there that's a work in progress. But that was kind of a place to take a first step because it's a smaller scope. So this is the background of the discussion is Paul lays out some of the benefits is that the controllers don't need elevated permissions, or at least not as many if they're only managing objects in the same namespace in which they run, right? So it gives you a way to kind of roll this out while things are still alpha, beta, while multi-tenancy story for Knative is really still being worked out, how security would work there, while Istio dependency or what are the networking implementation. There's a lot of multi-tenancy issues.
There's a lot of Kubernetes security stuff that needs to be worked out too.
Right. So in the meantime, while some of that's worked out, if you do have a cluster where you're more worried about those things, we think the benefits of being able to run serving and the rest of Knative in a namespace and have it only manage resources in that namespace is a good goal in the meantime while we're figuring out some of those other issues. It's kind of the only way in the short term we see that you could get a reasonably confidence that you have a fairly secure multi-tenant Knative if you're confident outside of Knative that you have a fairly secure multi-tenant Kubernetes, right? Like that's a whole separate issue. But if you feel like you can do multi-tenant Kubernetes securely, running Knative in a single namespace doesn't really surface extra attack vectors if it is isolated to resources in that namespace.
So Ben, this is Thomas here. The goal here is really multi-tenancy. I don't see that in the pull request. Maybe it's obvious for everyone, but at least when I look at it, I see this is clearly something we need for multi-tenancy. Is that correct? This is one of a longer list of 100 other things we need to do.
It's a way of sort of shoehorning this into a multi-tenant Kubernetes model, right? Like if you've already hardened namespaces as tenancy boundaries, then by slotting us into a single namespace and operating within those bounds, forgive me if I'm butchering this, Ben, but I believe that sort of gets us into a multi-tenant environment sort of as, somewhat as is, with a multi-tenant environment as is. And then there's hardening.
And this is an alternative to actually implementing multi-tenancy like natively in Knative or whatever that means. Like actually teaching Knative to be multi-tenant.
So it's not at odds with that. Like the proposal here is not to disallow Knative to function as it does today, where it can manage the entire cluster resources, but to simply add the option to only manage resources in a single namespace. And it's not just for multi-tenancy, but also for cluster stability concerns, right? Like Knative, if I have a production cluster and I want to run Knative release 0.3, right? Like I don't want to worry about bringing down my entire production cluster with something that happens, right? So if I know that Knative can't touch anything outside of its namespace, I have reasonable confidence that I'm not going to screw up the rest of my cluster if something goes wrong in Knative.
There's also a defense in depth aspect here, where even if you think that Knative handles multi-tenancy correctly, if you think it should only be running on one or maybe three namespaces, being able to lock it so that it can't touch anything else could be attractive.
And the controllers are sufficiently resource efficient that we don't worry about running 1,000 controllers for 1,000 namespaces.
This is a strictly more expensive way of running it, where the cost of the controller ends up in sort of user space.
Right.
So it's a trade-off.
And that was actually the first comment here on the issue as well, is that there is for sure, especially when you're thinking about running any kind of a function as a service on top of this, there is absolutely a cost that we would need to be aware of, but the cost is a little independent of the goal is not necessarily to do it, cost reasons aside, you do this more for cluster stability reasons or more because there's pieces of Knative are not yet tested to a large cluster, right? So if you can scope the what they're having to look at and work at, it might be easier to achieve performance goals, even though there's a higher overhead, if you can run multiple of these in a cluster. So that's kind of the general idea, right? If you can run this in a single namespace, I can run multiple Knative installs of potentially different versions with some caveats around CRDs and how Kubernetes, how we handle our versioning semantics and guarantees for CRD versioning. So I get some security benefits as well as just stability assurances, if you will, right? Like I know I don't have something with cluster admin privileges running rogue somewhere.
This would also mean that we couldn't really use admission control webhooks.
Yeah.
A thing that Evan said a moment ago was interesting to me was not that it can only touch one namespace, but it can only touch one or three namespaces. And I think that's really interesting because if we have a feature of Knative where it can, or you can set it up in a way that it is only allowed to touch a enumerated list of namespaces, then you can set up your multi-tenant cluster to have a pair of Knative namespace to user namespace for every tenant. Or you can set it up to have the one Knative namespace to three user namespaces. And that almost seems like a simpler way than having the Knative controllers in the same namespace as the user code, because it still allows us those admission webhooks and things like that. I might be misunderstanding the issue, though.
I followed what you said as far as this kind of came from the build working group call, that this proposal is to let the controllers manage resources in the namespace they're running in. And
I
only
understand.
That.
I understand.
Kind of, is that what you mean? Like let the controller manage resources in, say, these 3 namespaces, but not the entire cluster?
Right. If your Knative can be installed in one namespace with an enumerated list of namespaces that it can touch, and that relationship is hardened rather than just the whole namespace, that might preserve the user system boundaries a little bit better, and also be more true to the thing that Knative is, while also accomplishing a lot of the same goals that you have.
I think there's actually, building on Naomi's point, if you really wanted maximum defensibility, you could run the Knative controllers in a separate namespace controlling exactly one namespace. And so you would have the system level components, which might, if you wanted to do metering or something like that, you might want them to not be under the direct user control.
Exactly so.
Right.
So this is kind of seems like a generalization of,
yeah.
If we want to be able to run Knative in any way other than one tenant per Kubernetes cluster, we need some way to say, here is Knative and here's a list of namespaces it can manage, which could be like star or whatever for the entire namespaces, and also that list of namespaces could include the namespace, but not necessarily include the namespace.
I would recommend it never include the same namespace.
I think there's reasons to want to let people run it in their own namespace.
So one interesting example of this would be if you wanted to, for instance, install build, serving, and eventing all into the same namespace, right? And eventing at some point chooses that maybe the best way to build certain, event components, right, is to actually build on top of serving, right? Then serving would need to be able to act on that shared namespace to actually implement parts of eventing that happen to be co-located. It
is a case that we've been considering.
But yeah, I mean,
because
I don't think it's that outlandish.
It's attractive for some computation that you only want to run very occasionally. Things like meta controller to provision an event source, for example. You might run that, every 10 hours, and the rest of the time you want no computation.
So
I'm still worried about the admission webhooks and that kind of issue. Like you could easily get into a situation where you would accidentally modify a revision and get into an inconsistent state that you'd have a hard time digging out from.
So this is sort of something, I think there's sort of a meta theme here, right? Two of the things that came up, this sort of leaked into the build working group before this, and I scribbled down a couple of the things that came up in that context in the notes. There's 2 things in particular that, 3, I'll add a 3rd one I forgot about, which is relevant to this. The CRD definitions themselves are cluster scoped resources, so those would be inherently shared across the namespaces. There's also cluster scoped resources that the assorted controllers use, which are shared across the resource across the cluster. There's a shared definition of them, and the resources themselves live outside of a namespace. A 3rd thing, which is actually very closely related to the admission webhook, is in the future, the CRD definition will reference a conversion webhook, which will inherently have to be shared across all of those definitions. So I think that part of what we have to talk about is a separation of the set of things that need to exist sort of at the cluster scoping, and then the set of things that can run namespace scope. I think the webhook, the admission webhook, which does sort of superficial validation and whatnot, may, because of some of the mechanics of how webhooks work, need to be one of these things that exists at a higher level. I don't know, but we can think about sort of separating some of these conversations, I think, and attacking this more piecemeal, if that makes sense.
it is possible to scope webhooks to a single, to only look at a single namespace, right? But obviously the installation of that webhook, that actual like webhook configuration resource or whatever it is not namespace scoped. But that can be tackled in a different way. But you could have a webhook though that calls and that looks in namespace foo that only pings the webhook running in namespace foo, right? Like that is possible to do. You would need just a Sentinel, something that if you're securing this in like the OpenShift sense, where we have a higher level thing that would help install some of these, it would install the webhook for you. You wouldn't get a direct say into those restrictions, but it would still ping the webhook running in your namespace only for resources created in your namespace.
So the registration is definitely, I think, the most concerning part about the admission webhook and the way we're using those today. I think, and I agree that it's possible to filter those. I don't know that that same thing's true of the conversion webhooks, which is part of why I've been bringing them up, because they're still like mysterious to me, and I won't get to use them really for probably months. But yeah, basically that's the thing that comes to mind that actually looks a lot like the way we use webhooks today, and those are defined in that cluster scope resource. So it's hard for me to reason about whether or not we could delegate those in a similar way or shard those in a similar way. Does that make sense?
It does, and some of the motivation for what we're talking about here, outside of just benefits of running this in any generic Kubernetes, is specifically to OpenShift with the concept of operators. You know, in our case, you would have a Knative operator when you upgrade from version 0.2 to 0.3. The operator itself would handle upgrading any resources it needs, right? So, like we're not reliant on conversion webhooks landing to be able to upgrade some things, assuming that the CRD, assuming the new version of the CRD still works backwards compatible with the old one, at least in -1 or whatever. So. That is an unknown from our side, though, right? Is how would conversion webhooks integrate with what operators are doing today as far as independent upgrades? So that'll have to be explored.
Okay. So the issue is linked from here. As folks think about it, I would encourage you to go and comment on there. There's a bunch of stuff in the notes from this discussion that I think it would be good to surface into the issue. But hopefully everyone sort of groks the sort of space we're starting to explore. And as concerns come up, please raise them.
Yeah. And I would even go further and say, like, we're assuming that that Knative does not first want to tackle the harder multi-tenancy problems, and we're also assuming that people want to run more than one tenant per Kubernetes cluster. But if there are opinions or use cases to the otherwise, we'd love to hear them, just to make sure that this is not something that only we at Red Hat want, but that it's useful to the larger community.
So I have perhaps an interesting question. Have you guys thought at all about, this kind of relates to an orientation of this that Naomi was talking about, where you have a controller that operates over three namespaces. I think one of the concerns that this is targeting is sort of blast radius of rollouts, right? If you roll out a new controller to a single namespace, right? Like, okay, if it breaks that one namespace, it just breaks that one namespace. I'm wondering if we convey this through something like namespace selectors, whether we could basically deploy the new controller into a new namespace and then sort of ratchet the namespace selectors as a different way of sort of thinking about this, right? We have native serving 0.1 and native serving 0.2, and those actually, we basically tweak a namespace selector so that maybe all the current namespaces have a 0.1 label on them, and we slowly change those to 0.2 and 0.2. serving 0.2 stuff only operates over 0.2.
That
That might be another potentially interesting way of doing
that
it.
makes perfect sense, except for the hardening thing.
Right, except for, so my point is that there's several issues here that are, all interesting and whatnot, but, they're somewhat conflated at this point. I think that there's other interesting things that you can think about doing with the ability to run multiple parallel installations and, not necessarily need to eat the cost aspects to get the sort of limited blast radius of new rollouts benefits, if that makes sense.
Right. These are kind of all a general set of concerns, I would say, like about running Knative in production. Like, how would you do it in any way that's not one Knative per Kubernetes cluster? And if you want a new version of Knative, you just, right, like, how do you handle stage rollouts or rolling deployments? And how do you handle, well, in this case, it may be more like canaries, right? Like, I want to turn this one namespace on and then these two. And if that goes well, then turn on these. And I'm not sure, are there any other documents or any other ideas around like Knative? And I mean, it's early, right? So there may not be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that we have any documents around operability specifically and operator affordances.
Yeah, at this scale, I don't think so. I think one of the things I'm on the hook for is talking at the TOC meeting tomorrow about sort of how this working group is going and sort of where we're headed. One of the things that's on the sort of 6-month time horizon there, spoilers, is talking about sort of operator concerns. I think this definitely sort of fits squarely into there. So I'm glad you guys are sort of spearheading that and starting to look at that now.
Great. Thanks for the discussion.
All right. If there's nothing else, I would encourage folks to add stuff to the agenda for next week. I will not be here, but Mike Helmick volunteered to MC. And I will see you all on Slack or in 2 weeks.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.